Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Jessen Lecture of the 2019 spring semester. I am so honored and so thrilled to have an opportunity to welcome you not only to our first lecture of the season, but also to be up here, to actually be in the same row, and to be able to talk to, I think, one of my favorite architects in the world. If most of us in this audience would sit back and reflect on what we would imagine would be our dream scenario in architecture, it would be, and this is for those of you who are students, or would have been for those of us who are well past our prime, to either lead or work in a firm where our voice and our hand would shape critical aspects and stages of every project, where the projects occurred at every scale, with a single-family home receiving the same development and attention as would a new city business district, where one would engage with constituencies and communities who actively embraced their partnership with you, where projects were located in small towns in the largest cities, and pastoral landscapes and industrial brownfields, and where projects are both ground up on a tabula rasa or deeply embedded in and respectful of a historical context. From Manhattan apartment renovations to a slim linear residence perched on a bluff in the Midwest, from the renovation of a prison into a community center to the fitting out of new headquarters for Planned Parenthood, from a new hotel in Bentonville, Arkansas, to the renovation and repurposing of an H.H. Richardson former asylum for the insane in Buffalo into a conference center. I will not be going there. From a meatpacking district warehouse conversion into photography studios to a new art school at Yale, from a small drive-through bank branch in the iconic town of Columbus, Indiana, to a 4-acre redesign of a business district in downtown Indianapolis, from the Bard Conservatory of Music to 2 new residential colleges at Princeton University. Deborah Berke Partners is that firm that we all dream or dreamed of joining, that firm where every associate gets to engage fully in the design process, that firm that is not too small, that it can still take on large, complex projects, but not so large such that it still can treat every project in the firm as if it is their most important project. All of this manifests in the work itself with its careful and patient attention to context and constituents. There will not be a signature move, an in-your-face form, or any gratuitous excess in their work. Instead, there is always a sense of timeless rightness, as such both of the place yet connected to a more enduring and universal aesthetic. I'm going to read to you a passage from an essay that Deborah wrote more than 20 years ago, and which I think expresses the essence of why her firm has this timelessness and yet resolute placeness. So I'm quoting now from Deborah. "We exist in a culture where heroes have been replaced by celebrities, and 15 minutes of fame are valued over a lifetime of patient work. In this climate, the architect just becomes a celebrity in order to gain the opportunity to build. Those who do build tend to produce signature buildings designed to attract the attention of the media and sustain the public's focus. For under these rules, architecture can only emanate from the hand of the name brand architect. The built environment is strewn with these high-profile celebrity products, heroic gestures, neither made nor commissioned by heroes. What should architects do instead? A simple and direct response. Acknowledge the needs of the many rather than the few, address diversity of class, race, culture, and gender, design without allegiance to a priori architectural styles or formulas, and with concern for program and construction. We may call the result an architecture of the everyday." Well, Deborah, I have to disagree with you on one point. There are indeed heroes in architecture. You are an architect's architect, yet your continuing commitment to ensuring the field of architecture not only serves the greater world, but is also a reflection of that richly diverse world, has been a wake-up call to our discipline. You've long been a role model for so many, given that you built and still lead one of the all too few women-owned firms. And you are the first woman dean of the Yale School of Architecture. You really are a hero. So please join me in welcoming Deborah Berke to the dais.
Michelle, that was really nice. Thank you. And we were colleagues, and you guys are lucky. We really miss Michelle. It's nice for me to be in Austin. This is a city I don't get to come to enough, but I've been here often enough to know that it's a wonderful city, and this is one of the country's great universities and great schools of architecture, so it's a privilege to be here. So I am indeed here to talk about architecture. I'm an architect and a longtime teacher of design, but I think it's actually hard to talk about architecture because talks are linear and architecture is not. It's simultaneously so many things and often assumed to be even more things like development or construction. Building buildings can be anxiety-producing, but it's also really fulfilling, as I hope you're discovering. Architecture, in some ways, often or maybe always gets back to money. I mean, it's always about money, testing ideas and options and weighing them against the cost. But architecture is also, and maybe this is where you all get to feel really happy about materials and detailing and pattern and color and light and shadow. For me, that's a big part of the fulfillingness of being an architect. Architecture is about drawing. This is actually a drawing I did with a rapidograph on Mylar, so only the ancient people in the audience will know what I'm talking about. But it is, the act of drawing is fulfilling, and finding that balance between history, precedent, and what it means to create something new. And it's also about, oops, my little clicker isn't working here. About the environment and caring about not just the planet today, but the planet in the future and the generations of living things, including people and everything else who will come after us. It's making sure that every project is environmentally responsible, sustainable, and resilient. We talk about architecture in terms of experience, and I think this is very important. The way a person moves past a building or through a space, inhabits it, uses it as part of their everyday life. Ideally, it even impacts their everyday life in a positive, good, and meaningful way. So, I am often asked about my architectural approach in terms of minimalism. If you've been to the Charles Moore House where I'm sleeping tonight, it was a jolt to my system. While there's certainly an influence of minimalism in the work of my firm, our work, at least compositionally, is most frequently driven by geometric purity. We tend to prefer visual simplicity over something very busy, but that's not really the whole story. Because one of my favorite joys as an architect is to make a complex program with tons going on within the walls and behind the walls and under the floorboards and between the ceiling and the roof look utterly natural and effortless. Sorry, this is maybe it. And whether that's a studio or a hotel or in this instance a dormitory or truly flexible multi-purpose space, it can be by using the simplest envelope possible. A building doesn't have to wear its complexity on its face, and in fact a fairly complicated structure can appear simple and straightforward. And that approach can elevate big buildings and clarify small ones. And maybe cause someone to ask a question as they're in your building or outside of your building. When am I inside this bank? Is it when I'm underneath the overpass or getting my cash or inside the volume of the space itself? Or does another building cause somebody to ask, what actually defines my apartment? The balcony, the plants, the entrance to the overall building? Or is what I consider space, and again, this is not me speaking as an architect, but me hoping to influence the way a layperson thinks about building, is what I consider space, that's what's defined by the walls and the floors, or is it actually the art and the furniture? Or is it all those things and more? Is it the person I encounter when I go into that space each day? And does the architect make buildings and spaces to amplify and celebrate the work of others? I believe this strongly, that that's right. And is that true whether it's a thing, like you see here, or is it something you see or smell or hear? So every day, I think like that every single day, and it makes the ride on the subway a little more pleasant. It is my intention tonight, after that introduction of how I think about buildings, to show you 6 projects and ruminate a little bit more about them and ruminate in between them about being an architect. Recently, we completed a building in Indianapolis for the engine company Cummins, situated on the main street of downtown Indianapolis called Market Street. It's 3 blocks from the center of the city, which is a war memorial, which you see in the circle on the left of this plan. You can see the building from the war memorial. It sort of catches your eye off to the east. But you get a clearer sense, actually, of what the building is like as you turn the corner and see it from the south, where it opens to the park we created. Cummins bought an entire city block, and we could have met the program by filling the block, but instead we decided to go vertical and create a park in front of a narrower, smaller building. The light-filled lobby, in fact, has an entrance both from Market Street as well as one from the park, and in the center of this image you see the stairs going up to the 2nd floor. Remember that for a minute, if you will. The sculpture in the foreground of this picture, and I will talk about art a lot through tonight's talk, is by an artist named Kendall Buster, who actually started her studies as a medical scientist before becoming a sculptor. Anyway, at the top of those stairs that I asked you to look at, which you'll see in this, you see those stairs in the center left of this plan, which is of the 2nd floor. It's where the access from parking meets the access coming up from the lobby, and the idea was that everybody would meet at the same place, the place where they happen to serve the coffee, when they came to work in the day. So the idea of making a community and not relegating one form of arrival to be better or worse than any other. So as I just showed you in the plan, the parking structure connects to the office building through this bridge connector. Now, the folks at Cummins cared a lot about the work experience and the variety of workspace opportunities that were available for different types of activities and also different types of people, introverts and extroverts, and the kind of work they were doing, focus work alone or teamwork, large and small meetings. So you can see we did endless studies of workstations and counted them and arrayed them throughout the building. So many of the open office areas look like what you see in this slide. All the desks are height adjustable to sitting and standing. And as you can see in this picture, the office area is open to small workrooms. That's where the orange chair is, as well as to a larger shared area, which we call the social hub, where you see the people seated on the stairs. So in this floor plan, you'll see in the center middle the typical office layout, and then that social hub at the center of the plan, this one with the stadium stairs you just saw. And in this section, you can see each blue outline shows a social hub that connects 2 floors. So in a long, skinny building, it connects 4 work areas and makes them a community in effect, which was a large part of what Cummins wanted to do with this building. So each open office area connects 4 neighborhoods into a mini center, and then the dining area I showed you at the beginning is the bigger connected double height space at the bottom. Each of the 3 hubs has a different staircase to create identity within the building. This is a closer look at the stadium seating, which connects floors 7 and 8. This is the straight run stair with a kitchen below that connects floors 3 and 4. And here is the one we call the pretzel stair that connects floors 5 and 6. This building houses about 800 people. It doesn't look like that. Many of them hot desk when they're on the road, so it's a really vital and active place. And the narrow floor plate, which as I mentioned was very intentional, not only to allow us to create a park, but to allow the building to be completely daylit, that then required a series of passive shading elements, horizontal shades and vertical fins that vary in depth depending on their location. and a bunch of opaque panels that helped increase insulation around the perimeter and provide places for solid walls and privacy as per the floor plan. In the social hub photographs that I showed you with the staircase, you might have seen a piece of a brightly colored mural. It's actually 6 stories. It goes through the whole building by a Nigerian-American painter based in Philadelphia named Odili Donald Odada. And the idea of the fenestration plan in the center of the building, where there's less screening, in fact, because there's less people working on computers, allows the art to actually be experienced from those in the park outside. So it is both a public and private piece of art all at once. When we started on this project a few years ago, and for those of you who are in construction, from the day we won the design competition to the day the first person moved in to work here was 28 months. So that was from picking up the pencil to move-in day. It was a sort of extraordinary piece of work for everybody involved, not just us. When we started on it, this end of Market Street was virtually empty, and now you can see in this photograph there's a Whole Foods across the street, and new residential buildings, one of which you can see reflected on our facade. It's not a particularly nice building, but there are a lot more people downtown than there used to be, and this building has played a role in making that happen. My clicker is a little slow, I apologize. Oh, and you missed the movie because I clicked too many times. All right, let's see if this movie actually works. The park was designed by David Rubin of Land Collective, and it's meant to be a real 21st century experience, so about bicycles, but also flowers, birds, Wi-Fi for anybody who goes there, and a great place to hang out on the weekends, and I think the film isn't going, so take my word for it. Okay. The next project is in rural western upstate New York, just off Lake Erie and closer to Cleveland than to Syracuse. I don't know if any of you have a sense of geography of the Northeast, but anyway, it's very cold and snowy, so be glad you're here. And in the 1960s, the architects Harry Cobb, James Freed, and I.M. Pei used this kind of modernist planning and distinctive design language to create a remarkable, in its own way, austere campus for the State University of New York. So you can see the ring road in this original design for the pure plan of the campus. But as you can see from this photograph, the campus authorities didn't stick to the rigor of the original plan. And at the red square in the middle here is a building called the Rockefeller Arts Center. It was originally meant to address the loop that comes off the circle, but as you can see in this, and it got subsequently worse, they built parking lots in the middle of the circle, and everybody arrived at the wrong side of the building because they parked their cars as close to the building as they could, because of course it was snowing. Anyhow, we were hired to renovate the building and do a 60,000 square foot addition that would solve all of its problems. This is the architectural character of the campus: monumental board form concrete buildings, including the Rockefeller Arts Center, which is on the bottom right, completed in 1968. You saw it in the master plan on the previous slide. And this is the site plan of the Rockefeller Arts Center as it is today. So the back of the building is now the front. The red part is our addition. We gave the building a new front door facing all those parking lots and all those other new buildings that have been built in the middle of the circle. We did dozens and dozens of massing studies to figure out how to add on to that concrete pay building, how the building would relate to the existing, as you can see in this study model. And I talked about how horrible that concrete wall was. You'll see it in a minute. You see it here in the diagram. It's the gray surface. We decided to punch through it in two places. It was sort of the biggest design challenge, how to get everybody, keep the loading dock and get everybody else into the building: students, theater goers, faculty, raw materials, because it's an art school, musical instruments and the like, all on one facade. And that was what the pay facade looked like. So not exactly welcoming, and that one gray door was where both the art supplies went in, the theater goers went in, and the garbage came out. So it was not particularly successful. But because the material palette was so limited on the campus, we thought about how we could possibly use it in new ways. So what you really see here is the mock-up for our new concrete. We decided to develop a distinctive diagonal board form to differentiate our work from the work of our predecessors. But it was interesting as we worked on this that the legacy of the 1968 campus was actually an extensive local expertise in architectural concrete. So the sons and grandsons of the men who built the original buildings actually did the concrete work on our building. We took advantage of that skill for our addition. So the play of light and shadow and the color of the concrete is quite beautiful. It's intentionally not pristine. It's meant to be rugged and textured and very sensual at the same time. And just as we did at Cummins, we thought a lot about light raking across surfaces and how to calibrate not only the texture of the concrete, but also the relationship of metal and glass. And we inverted Pei's material palette, so more glass, more surface texture, and less concrete. Here's our work in relationship to his. From far away, you can see his building on the left. From far away and straight on, you can see the materials and the extension of the horizontal lines and the rhythm of fenestration. And as you can see from the angle, you see more of the complex three-dimensional relationships, both between the two buildings and then within our building itself, which has a whole lot more intentional depth on it than the Pei building did, which was, in our opinion, way too taut to play with the sun in any exciting way. So we also gave the facade some depth to decrease solar gain and provide the building texture and rhythm in contrast with the 1960s vertical surfaces of the whole campus. And we wanted our building to allow students and the public to see the activities that were going on inside, like this piano silhouetted in the cantilever dance studio up above, or who is in the cafe space down below. This picture was taken right when construction had been completed, so the building wasn't open yet, but you can see how we brought the concrete, which we sort of carried it from the outside into the interiors. So this is the entrance. When you go to that vast parking lot, you now approach a door which is actually sheltered from the elements, which one needs in this part of the world. And when you go through that door, you go right to the cafe. A lot of focus in my work on how quickly you can get to the coffee. It opens to then views of the campus, which when the snow melts in the end of June is pretty beautiful. The building houses all of the arts: performing arts, applied arts, artisanal skills, and theater. This is the new ceramics studio. And this is the sculpture studio. I went to art school as an undergraduate, and I love the directness and hands-on aspect of art-making spaces, like this new welding foundry. It might not look like an architect was here, but an architect really was here, because I care a lot about spaces like this. We located that hood ever so carefully. The exit sign maybe not quite as carefully. In this slide, you actually are looking at two images. On the left side of the right-hand image, and this will come up again later in the talk, you'll see how we kept the markings from years of use in the theater. And I think when you work on old buildings, knowing what to save really matters a lot. So this theater tradition of visiting crews and actors was to write on the concrete wall, and we did everything we could to save that. And on the left-hand side of the left-hand image, you see actually Pei's concrete wall, which we have made a signature part of the inside of the building, where it's a much more pleasant environment than it was when it was the entrance. So that big daylit dance studio is a space for practice and instruction, but it also can be for performances. You can see from the chairs there. It's a basic, inexpensive, other than the sprung floor, space, but the light and proportions make it a stunning space to work in. And I do really believe that about light and proportion, that rooms don't have to be expensive to be fabulous to be in, but they have to be conceived. So with open spaces like that, the building has become the new center on campus for performance and art, and also for people who want to feel a part of that vibrancy. So IMPay is still alive. But another thing about our practice, Michelle alluded to this a little bit in her introduction, is that we work with a lot of old buildings to transform them for contemporary life. And some, like that one, is a new building attached to a building that's only 50 years older. It was designed by IMPay. He's here. He's now 101. But most of the work that we do is what I might call posthumous collaborations with some pretty amazing architects of the past, like Albert Kahn and Louis Kahn and H.H. Richardson and Shreve Lamb and Harmon. They're the architects of the Empire State Building, and McKim, Mead, and White. All of those gentlemen, they're all men, are pictured here. And this trio is a particularly interesting one. H.H. Richardson, Thomas Story Kirkbride, and Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, you're in architecture school, so you've heard of two of them, I'm sure, but probably not Kirkbride, the guy in the middle, who was a 19th century psychiatrist from Philadelphia who developed a form of mental hospital which, with such a distinctive floor plan that it's actually called the Kirkbride Plan. And it had to do with mental health care. The crazier you were, the further you were from the door, and there was only one door in the entire building at the center. But on a very positive side, and I really mean to be fair to this amazing thinker of the 19th century, he paid the first real attention to what we would today call PTSD that followed the Civil War. So the Kirkbride Hospital started being built in the 1870s. And one of the most famous of the Kirkbride buildings is the one in Buffalo, which was designed by H.H. Richardson with an extensive landscape around it by Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, it is an extraordinary structure. You see it here. This is when it was abandoned. You can see the fence around it keeping people away. This photograph is by a man named Chris Payne, who documents abandoned insane asylums. I don't know what those stripes are about, but they have nothing to do with either Olmsted, Richardson, or me. But we were asked to renovate the center of this building. And what you can see in this plan, particularly if you look to the right, not of the stripes, but of the red outline, is that the building was once more than 2,500 feet long, so about half a mile. 3 wings on the right were taken down for new psychiatric building built in the 60s, which is awful. And we were hired to renovate the 3 buildings in the middle, which are solid red in this drawing. So it looked like this when we started, including the terrible addition in the middle, which is from the 1940s. The stone, which is a red sandstone, was stunning, but had literally not been maintained or repointed in more than 100 years. So it was in very, very bad shape. And the building is a load-bearing masonry structure, so on the ground floor and in the basement, the walls were over 3 feet thick. And because of current seismic code, you were limited in the amount of holes you could make in them. So it was a tough building to figure out how to reconceive. And you can see in this drawing the derelict state as well as some of the beautiful details of the original construction. This is a hallway. The hallways were 16 feet wide and faced south, a single-loaded corridor where all the patients sat in the sun during the daytime, whereas the patient rooms were tiny, some of them only 7 feet wide and 11 feet deep, and they felt like this. So we had to be very, very careful in how we would connect those spaces to actually make them be hotel rooms. There were occasional treasures, things like this fireplace that we really wanted to save. It gets back to that idea of what's the character and soul of a building. And there was a lot of worn out furniture and a sense of pathos that we knew we had to get rid of if this was going to enter into a new life. The landscape was restored to much of what Olmsted had designed. You can see some of that here. The garden walls, one of the cures was actually gardening and farming. More stripes, okay. that blots out the fact that the landscape hasn't grown in yet, but just at the top middle, you can see the topmost piece of our new entrance addition beyond. And within that very modest addition, and we had to fight with the preservationists tooth and nail to get that little glass box, is a new stair that brings you up to the second floor of the building, which is the main floor, and actually is the hotel lobby. On the ground floor, sort of where those people are coming out, is a center for documents of historic architecture from Buffalo, which has an extraordinary architectural history and tradition. Further up in the center of the building, we added stairs and bridges so that you could access previously hidden rooms and move through the building in a logical structure that you could understand as a guest, and so that we could create new vistas through, so you could see some of these amazing rooms and opportunities like this one. We added a lot of color to complement and celebrate the original volumes and spaces. And we restored original details wherever we could, although we never, ever, ever imitated or copied the original building. You can see the quality of some of the detailing here, like on the old original staircase, and here in the curved connection between the main building and the wings. These tile floors were actually in great condition after 150 years, so we just cleaned them and waxed them. And here is that fireplace now in a new space. The hotel hasn't been furnished yet in this photograph, but this is a lounge area, and we use that fireplace now. That's wonderful. And you can see here, and better here, one of these long south-facing hallways, which we've restored. And the little white volumes that you see, the tall little white volumes that you see just to the right of, just to the left of the light fixtures, are actually things we added, and the goal was to make them almost as not present as possible, and it was literally to be able to lay out a bathroom within the minuscule rooms that were where the patients used to live. So this is a typical guest room in the corner of one of the buildings, and you can see how beautiful the ceilings are and how hard we had to work to get in air conditioning and heat and lighting to contemporary standards. And this is another room with a fantastic old column, and whenever we found something like this, the idea was save it, don't prettify it, let the 150 years worth of different paint colors be part of the character of the space. On the top of our addition is a balcony off a bar that you see here in Buffalo. You don't get to go out there all that often, but when it's beautiful, it's really beautiful. And here you can see where it is atop of the new glass entry volume. And it's now a happily re-inhabited building, and in fact, I consider myself a strident modernist, but last year we won the top design prize from the National Trust for Historic Preservation for saving this building, so yay. Now, we actually design a fair number of hotels in my practice, most of them for the folks called the 21C Museum Hotel out of Louisville, Kentucky. I don't know if any of you have ever stayed at one of those. Can't really call them a chain. There are 8 of them, but each one is decidedly different. 7 of the 8 are adaptive reuse projects, and the one in Oklahoma City is in a former Ford Motor Company building designed by the great American architect Albert Kahn. It has a stunning facade. It's a full city block. It's a ginormous building. It has a stunning facade that we were happy to restore and really celebrate. But the floor plan of the building is literally a building you could drive a car around inside of. In fact, that's what they did. They built cars and then drove them around inside. It was so immense that we had to cut shafts through the building. You can see them in the section here. And as you can imagine, the floors were really thick and really heavily reinforced, so it was hard to make these small holes. But the idea was to bring light to the interior of the building to make it work for hotel rooms. So you can see the bottom of one of those light shafts here in the ceiling of the lobby. And if you don't know about the 21C Museum hotels, they really are contemporary art museums within hotels. It's not a marketing gambit. It's actually the real collection of the people who own the hotels. The building also had massive columns, which we celebrated as well, and you can see this one here is a focal point of the bar. And in the hallways upstairs, where they went on, 16 of them in a row, you can see them here. We celebrated them, we lit them, we made the rest of the hallway quite dark. They marched down, true architects delight, they go marching down the hallway. And what you also see here is then one of those light shafts as it cuts through the building. The fourth side of this glass block volume is actually a guest room. This is what the inside of that light shaft looks like, and due to the reinforcing, the hole we could cut had to be pretty small, as I said before. And then this is the inside of one of those guest rooms that looks into that light shaft, and people who like quiet really, really like these rooms. And at the top of the building, where we saved the water tower for its character, we also took what had been a maintenance shed and turned it into the rooftop suite, complete with a terrace and garden. Now, this is one more adaptive reuse project. We do a lot of new buildings in the office, but it seemed like this was a timely thing to talk about because it has positive, I think, social environmental impact as well as positive environmental impact in terms of the general environment, broadly speaking. These buildings were all designed by an architect by the name of C.B.J. Snyder, who is not remotely as famous as Albert Kahn or H.H. Richardson or Louis Kahn or any of those guys, but arguably perhaps just as important, certainly in New York City, where he was the superintendent of school buildings from 1891 to 1923, when the city was growing rapidly with immigrants primarily. And he built over 450 schools. If you've been to New York, all the public schools look the same. This is why. One guy did them all. And one of his innovations was to design schools with H-shaped floor plans, which created protected side yards that could be playground areas, and also allowed the city to buy less expensive property because they would carve the playground out of it. So they opened schools quickly at the turn of the last century. And we had the privilege of renovating one of C.B.J. Snyder's buildings, the old PS 122 in the East Village, which had a slightly different site condition. It was on a corner, and it had a very small side yard, which is at the top of that red rectangle. Now, when it was used as a school, it looked like this, went back when the elevated trains still ran on First Avenue, so a very long time ago. Even I was not alive then. But the building was later abandoned by the Board of Education and reoccupied by arts groups, guerrilla-style occupation, where they literally broke into the building in the early 1970s. And it had, these are photographs from that period, it had many of the historic details of the original building, but was in terrible, terrible shape, and that elaborate cornice had been removed long before the 70s. It was truly, truly dilapidated by the time we were hired to re-envision it. It had beautiful bones, and if you look carefully at the lower left-hand corner of this image, you see the handrail, and then you see the lower brackets, which don't have a handrail on it. It was a school that started at kindergarten, so they had tiny little handrails for tiny little children to go up and down the stairs. And then it also had details like this, beautiful metalwork throughout the building that we tried to retain where possible. Now, as I said, the old PS 122 housed a number of arts organizations, and it was very tightly programmed, and when we started the project, they all hated each other and were fighting over space, and one of the things we did was convince them that if they shared certain things, they actually could have more space for their own functions. So the goal was to uncover redundancies and take advantage of those overlaps. So we came up with a simple but bold strategy, certainly not what the City of New York thought we were going to do, which is we lifted the largest theater in the building onto the top floor to create a column-free space by taking the roof off the building. Required much less structural reinforcement, which meant we could afford to do a lot of the other interesting things we wanted to do. So in this diagram, you see our addition is in the empty lot where the playground used to be. And it allowed more of the building to be used by various tenants, and it even allowed us to get people up to the roof. So the ground floor plan is on the left here, and you can see where all the solid stuff is. That was the tiny little indentation back to the bump just above it. We created an at-grade entrance, necessary for ADA, elevator, proper bathrooms, plausible, real 21st century fire stair. You can see the old stairs in the building, clearly non-compliant. You see a floor above with some of the old classrooms that are painting studios now. And on the top floor, what you see in the plan on the left is the big community theater space for Performance Space New York, with now a double height, which is what you see on the plan on the right. And the arts organizations that we worked with, who are all in this building, like Mabu Mines and Performance Space, they all said to us, whatever you do, don't make it too nice. Don't erase our history, and don't obliterate the changes that occurred over time that make this building special. So in the new theater, which looks like this, you can see that we left the old brick, however mottled it was, and kept the space very raw, and kept our interventions intentionally very visible, so you could tell the old from the new. Again, as I said about the other project, there's nothing fake old in what we put in this building. This is a really early study model, and you can see the addition that takes you up to the roof, the new cornice, which is in effect a guardrail around a new public roof terrace, a cardboard version, pretty lame, of the scrim that in cardboard didn't quite capture what we actually did, which is an outer skin of perforated stainless steel and its relationship to the very cheap windows that are behind it. So a way to hide them, but also give the building a little bit of mystery. The idea is that it shimmers in the daylight, has varying degrees of transparency, and at night allows light out to indicate activity. This is a very vital and active neighborhood. And you can see on the right of this slide the missing, how we replaced the missing cornice with a bench/railing on that roof terrace. The idea is that the addition is present but doesn't have a mass that gets in the way of one's ability to appreciate the original structure, but you recognize that something new is going on there. And you can see that mass here, and then what it looks like at night when there are theater events going on. So neighborhood is thrilled, and the building is filled all the time, and we're really excited. Just reopened. Now, I showed you really quickly a whole bunch of projects, SUNY Fredonia, PS 122, Mabu Mines, the community tenants in these various buildings, the Hotel Henry. It's a special pleasure for us to work with and for artists of all different kinds. We find that the dialogue is rich and the collaboration is meaningful. Not all the artists that we work with are traditional fine artists. This is a studio space for Elizabeth Akins. They make rugs. The idea was to account for the needs of these people as well, these creative people, so that's a sprung floor. And many years ago, we designed a new home for the Yale School of Art. One part of it involved the radical renovation of the Jewish Community Center in New Haven, which was designed by Louis Kahn. And that building houses studios and classrooms for photography, graphic design, and undergraduate painting, and it has an experimental theater for the drama school. But we also designed a new building immediately adjacent for graduate painting, and their crit space is shown in this picture here. And the idea was to treat art students like real artists with studios where they did their work, where they could plan their life as an artist in the future while they were at school. So years later, I met an artist who had studied and worked in one of those spaces. His name is Titus Kafar. We actually met at one of the 21C Museum hotels. We had never met at Yale, but I was glad that our paths had crossed because we had many overlapping interests, clients, collectors, institutions, and mutually held very strong beliefs. You can see his painting here. This is the 21C Museum Hotel in Louisville, and his painting is the one on the upper right. Now, a lot of Titus's work interrogates the canon of American art history, particularly as it relates to the representation of African Americans. And for Titus, as for us, art is not remote from life, it's an integral part of life. And art literally changed Titus's life. He lived on the street as a kid. And he is working to use art to change the lives of others. In November, it was announced that he was one of this year's MacArthur Award winners. So now he's officially a genius, but when we started working with him, we knew he was a genius already. And we are working with Titus on the design of something called Next Haven. That's what this is. Not how I would spell it, but okay. And it's located in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven, and the idea is that it's a facility, community space, artist studios, and live workspace for artists. And it's just a block and a half away from the James Hillhouse High School. Next Haven will occupy 2 abandoned factory buildings, one where medical equipment was made and one where ice cream was made, lined in 6-inch thick cork, really remarkable structure. More recently, they had been making counterfeit goods in these buildings, so this is a happy change. This is a plan of the neighborhood of Dixwell. It's a medium density, mostly low income neighborhood, so near to Yale physically, but a world away from Yale, and we're trying to change that. And initially we thought we would retain the entire complex of buildings, but various existing conditions made that more costly and unnecessarily complicated. So we kept 2 of the buildings and decided to demolish the not so good ones. Retaining and restoring the existing fabric that was good, adding more studio space and a gallery, adding a place for artists to party, because artists like to party, and adding to that then a distinct materiality, GFRC panels for cladding, affordable, durable, setting this center apart from the brick and wooden residential context of the neighborhood. So it's going to be a new community hub. I won't bore you with the floor plans in too much depth. This is the ground floor, but you can see artist studios on the right, a gallery in the middle, community space and open hall on the left, smaller spaces. And for the 3 resident artists, there are live workspaces on the 2nd and 3rd floor of the new building. Construction is more than started. This is a rendering of the exterior. The building on the far right, which was the ice cream factory, now has 8 working artists in it. They started their residencies last month. The idea is that the whole thing will be intentionally open and welcoming in a neighborhood where most buildings are defined by pull-down gates. The idea is that it sends a come in and see what we're doing message. The idea is that all of the building is accessible to everybody except the artist studios where they do their work, and it's meant to be a tough working building for real. The second old factory space where they made the beakers is the Great Hall, as I said a minute ago. The skylight is original, and there'll be smaller studios for architects, graphic designers, and people like that off the perimeter of this building. So there on the left, you see one of the artists now in residence in one of the studio spaces. You see the old rafters on the ceiling, and you see a group of the artists here, Titus in the middle with the hat, posed in a nearby park. And we really wanted the building to announce that something great was happening in Dixwell. And at every part of this, Titus expressed deep care for his community. And I think that leads to this idea that there is an expanded idea, there should be an expanded idea of what we do in practice. That, not just what we do in my office, but what we all do as architects. Work with local organizations whose mission appeals to you. Often those projects fall outside the standard commissioned architect-client relationship. We host art exhibitions in our office for artists whose work we find meaningful. This is Kiki Smith. We don't show her work because we don't have the necessary insurance, but she did come and see a show of an artist she likes. We run kids' workshops. This one's at the Cooper-Hewitt, but we do them in local schools as well, almost wherever we build buildings. We try to be engaged and engaging beyond the world of design insiders. Now, a little bit of stardom. I did appear on Ida Garten's Barefoot Contessa. I have never been more famous than the week after this aired, when people would just come up to me on the street and like touch me. I saw you on Ina, as though they owned you because you had been on Ina. I was explaining architecture to Jeffrey, her husband, in the car while she was home cooking dinner, which was a really good division of labor because I'm no cook. And I've also been on a bunch of podcasts, this with Michael Ian Black, ostensibly comedic, that would be him, not me, I'm pretty serious. But I like the idea of architects and architecture to not be intimidating, to be part of broader, accessible culture and exist in balance with the rest of life. So that perspective does come in handy in my other job, as Michelle said. I've always taught as well as practiced, and 2.5 years ago I became the dean at the School of Architecture at Yale. So I like thinking about our discipline and our profession and our work and how we interact with the public in a pedagogic context as well as a context of practice. I probably bored you with some of those thoughts tonight. But since becoming dean, I've been trying to do that even more intensely. The position, as Michelle's is here, is an opportunity to put these values into a broad range of action. These days, I think, happily, it's fashionable for architects to respond to pressing social needs. That's good. But we shouldn't be doing it because it's fashionable. At Yale, we've made social engagement a core of architectural education for more than 50 years, and our work with people like Mayor Harp, who's in this photograph. Actually, the mayor of the city is a graduate of the Yale School of Architecture. Want to broaden architecture's reach. It's often seen as an elite profession. One, it doesn't have to be that, and two, that shouldn't be how it functions in the world. I think architecture can be and must be good as architecture. That matters first and foremost, and then also do good, sometimes by program, sometimes by impact, sometimes by presence. In my teaching career, I've especially loved getting to see the emergence of new talent and future collaborations, because tomorrow's architects are going to have to engage with the broader architecture of the whole built environment more flexibly and more creatively than we have done. I apologize that we haven't done as good a job as we should. Last year there was a movie called Columbus that included scenes that were beautifully shot at the Irwin Union Bank, which we designed in that city. And
that's when I started coming here.
I guess you can't hear the sound that comes with this.
Comforting.
But what the star is talking about, and if you've seen the movie, you'll know. But what she's talking about is how discovering this building, discovering architecture, allowed her to step outside her very miserable and unhappy life and see the world in a better, bigger, more inclusive and happier, more positive way. And she talks about me in the movie. It was a little weird because I didn't know I was kind of in this movie until I went to see it. And I went to see it with my 25-year-old daughter, and she was mortified. It was nice to see architecture in a movie that talked about the power of good building. So I think we all have to hope that we can change the world through the built environment, through architecture, because that's what we should be doing as architects. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
If you have questions, just please raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you.
And maybe we could turn the lights up so that that spotlight
That would
is
help
not
too. A little
killing
bit of
me.
lights going up.
Bye, everybody. Well, no questions are okay, too.
Yeah, last chance. Okay.
Hi, my name's Cassandra, by the way. You mentioned that you didn't really consider yourself as an architect that historically preserved buildings, but as you can iconically see, these buildings are very historically preserved. How did you first get into this journey?
The honest answer to that is when I was a really baby architect and had no work and only had my childhood friends in New York City who were artists, they were buying lofts in old rundown buildings, and they would hire me like in exchange for a painting or something like that to renovate their loft. And I realized that I really enjoyed interacting with the old building. It was like a collaborator, and I'm a huge believer in collaboration of all kinds, and so in that case it was collaborating with the building. Now I talk more about collaborating with all those dead white guys who designed beautiful buildings many, many years ago, but old buildings are a form of collaboration for me, so I don't think of myself as a preservationist, although I think we should cherish the buildings we have and not tear them down willy-nilly, but I think for me it was that early introduction to the idea of collaborating with what's already there. Oh.
So thank you. The talk was really, I really loved the talk. And one of the things, you have this kind of double life as an extraordinarily successful practitioner and as an extraordinarily successful educator. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about like the particular role of schools with regard to teaching practice, because that's a big issue in our school, about like the degree to which, and we talked about that a little bit earlier today, about like my own feeling, we have too many practitioners on our faculty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, and maybe you could talk a little bit about your own sense of the relationship of the two.
Wow. Well, I think architecture schools should have practitioners, just like medical schools should have doctors. But medical schools also need biochemists and people who aren't actual clinicians with patients, and architecture schools need both practitioners and then those who study and are scholars or who get at architecture from different sides. So first and foremost, I would say as an educator that I think a professional school is about finding the balance between those who do it, those who know about it, and those who study it kind of from the inside, the other side, or from its history. So part one is finding the right balance. Part two is maybe actually worrying a little bit less about whether somebody's a practitioner or not, and worrying more about whether they're good teachers, because there are many famous architects, and God knows we've brought them to Yale and been profoundly disappointed, who can't teach, or who only want to teach what they do, not what the student, encouraging the student to develop their own voice. So I'm not really answering your question, but I'm strongly in favor of architects, historians, scholars, environmental scientists, structural engineers, everybody who teaches in an architecture school, urban planners, landscape architects, industrial designers, interior designers, whatever the big umbrella that is architecture, that it's taught by people who are not only passionate but who know how to teach, and some of them should practice and some of them should be coming from the side of the academy, let's say. In my own life, it's worked for me, but to be a practitioner, I care passionately about materials, as you probably could tell from what I was talking about tonight, but I'm not much of a scholar, to be honest, so practice informed my teaching because scholarship didn't. I'm not in the research library. That's not how I work or how I think. And now I don't have anything more to say to your question. Sorry.
When did you realize how good you are as an architect, and what would you say to students who don't necessarily know how good we are yet?
I would say the honest answer to this, and this is not false modesty, imposter syndrome goes all the way up. And I have confidence in my passions, and I always hope that my next building is going to be better than all the ones that preceded it. I don't really know how else to describe it. It's a good thing that architecture is an old person's profession. Cesar Pelli is 92, and Frank Gehry will be 90 in a couple of weeks, and mostly architects are blessed with long lives, and that allows them to keep working on it because it's a slow build of a profession. So I would say for your work, you should be confident about your talents and commitment to architecture, but not overconfident, because how you get better. There was a guy back there with a hat. I could see the hat.
You spoke a little bit about doing all of these projects that were by a bunch of dead white guys. Could you speak a little bit about bringing a female perspective in the context of the history of the profession that has been overwhelmingly male, you know, the feminine design aspect that you bring?
Wow. Well, I think, you know, women architects, and happily now there are more women in leadership positions and in academic leadership positions like Michelle or the dean at Princeton, the dean at Columbia, me at Yale, other schools, are dean at Rice, other schools around the country. So we are starting to see a change. And I think all of us would say, first and foremost, I want to be judged as an architect, not as a woman architect. Now that said, what it's like now, and it's better than it was, but it's still pretty bad, but what it was like early in my career when I would go to client meetings or site meetings and be the only woman in the room, or my very first faculty meeting at Yale, long time ago when I was a junior faculty member, the head of the committee turned to me and told me it was my job to go get coffee because I was the only woman in the room. Or my early tactics on site meetings was to read the sports section of the newspaper. This was long before cell phones. Every morning before I went to a construction site. So when all the guys were talking about, you know, who had won the night before, I like sports, so it was okay. It wasn't like this huge burden, but so that I could participate in that conversation, because it was always about trying to find a way in. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. Other than that, I think each of us, first and foremost, are individuals trying to be architecture and using the built environment as a way to express our passions the way a novelist might or a composer might. And then at the same time, as a woman in a majority male profession, figuring out all the ways in which you could get your voice out there, because there were so many obstacles to doing it. I think it's slowly getting better. One of the ways that it's getting better, one of the many ways it's getting better is women everywhere. So buildings it's not like sitting in a room and not writing a novel. You have a client, there's budget, there's money, there's property, there's laws, there's consultants, and many, many, many of those people are men. Clients are men, board of trustees are mostly men, banks are mostly run by men, all that aspects of building. But that's changing. So now boards of trustees have women on them, or university presidents are women. And so the environment in which buildings get commissioned and decided is also a more inclusive environment than it was when I started as an architect, 30 plus years ago.
Hi. So your work has certainly seriousness and austerity and loveliness to it, while also taking seriously environmental sustainability. And that seems to be something that's often pushed to the side of serious aesthetic considerations, or something that's seen as, it's inevitably going to be something that's bringing things down and we have to cover it up in some way. So how do you navigate that relationship?
The honest answer is I wish we navigated it a little bit better. I think we try hard, and our strongest skill set in that, and I think there are more architects now focusing on it in a bunch of different ways. Alan Organsky, who teaches at Yale, who's involved in large timber structures and circular economies of building materials. For us, it's primarily through this adaptive reuse model, where you play off the strengths of an existing building, because there's so much embedded energy in a building already. Why would you tear it down? And then you work at those strengths. If the walls are thick, then that helps with how you heat it and cool it, or things like that. We try very hard, because it's something I believe very strongly that our climate is changing, and buildings contribute enormously to that, and it's not good, and we have to address it. I think every one of us in every way that we design should be thinking about it, but you will find your own voice and what that looks like that's consistent. I think it can't be your aesthetic, but it needs to be part of your aesthetic.
Thank you for your talk. My favorite part probably was listening to how you navigate these different tenants and people who are going to be in your buildings. I was wondering, I guess using the example of the Brooklyn theater space, how you think architecture should and does, in your experience, navigate policy?
Not sure I totally heard you, and it's more because this thing is groaning. So you say it again, and I'll move away from the groaning thing.
How have, in your experience, you navigated policy and code in architecture, and how do you think the architecture necessarily should shape that or engage?
So the good idea of code, of course, is that it's meant to save lives. And most code is really, really, really out of date and controlled by people who either have a vested interest in the building industry going a certain direction, or are clueless about the building industry and whose positions can be bought. So obviously we don't want people to die in fires, and we want them to be able to get out of buildings in fires or gas or attacks or whatever the bad situation might be. But being able to update what we can do with contemporary materials or to require greater and higher performance standards of buildings, given what we know about global climate change, should be what buildings codes do, but they mostly don't. They mostly reflect the fairly petty interests of local government. That negative enough?
Thank you so much. We really